For 7 straight years, every Friday afternoon without fail, a black fleet van from Nordell Construction pulled up outside the same two-bay shop on the outskirts of Lethbridge, Alberta, and dropped off another machine nobody else wanted to touch. No phone call ahead, no explanation attached. Just a work order clipped to the ignition, a pickup deadline stamped in red, and another piece of heavy equipment with problems so specific, so quietly catastrophic, that Nordell's own mechanics had already given up on it. The man who ran that shop never complained. Not once. Victor Hale was 42 years old. He had the kind of hands that told the whole story before he opened his mouth, permanently darkened around the knuckles, a pale scar running across the base of his left thumb from a press incident in 2009, calluses, thick enough that he barely registered heat anymore, broad through the shoulders but not imposing. The kind of man who took up exactly the space he needed, and no more. His hair had gone gray at the temples earlier than it should have, and his eyes carried that particular stillness you only see in people who have had to make peace with something enormous, and decided, quietly, to keep going anyway. His shop sat at the end of Harrow Industrial Road, past the aggregate supplier and the fencing company, where the pavement cracked and the signage got sparse. Hale, Mechanical. Black letters on a white board. The sign had been there since his father ran the place. Victor had repainted it once, when Joanna was pregnant, and he was feeling optimistic about everything. That was 8 years ago. Joanna died 14 months after their daughter was born. Cervical cancer, caught late, moved fast. She was 36. Their daughter, Wren, was 13 months old when the hospital called Victor in the middle of replacing a gearbox for a farming co-op outside of Fort Macleod. He drove to the hospital with hydraulic fluid still on his forearms. He never went back to that gearbox. The co-op eventually called someone else. For a while after, Victor existed more than he lived. The shop kept the lights on. Wren's daycare kept the days structured. His mother drove 2 hours from Medicine Hat every Tuesday to watch Wren, so Victor could work late. He didn't ask her to. She just started showing up, the way good parents do, when the alternative is watching their child drown. The routine that rebuilt him was not glamorous. Wake at 5:30, start the coffee. Check if Wren had kicked off her blankets. Get her up at 6:15. Make her breakfast, always something warm, because Joanna had believed in warm breakfasts and Victor had carried that forward like a small daily prayer. School drop-off by 7:50, back at the shop by 8:10, work until 3:40, pick up Wren, come back to the shop for the late jobs, home by 7, dinner, homework, bath, bed. Sit in the kitchen for 40 minutes with whatever was left of the day, then do it again. No vacations. No evenings off. No one to call when Wren had a fever and there was still a transmission waiting, no backup. But the Friday deliveries from Nordell kept coming, and that mattered more than Victor ever let on. 7 years earlier, before Joanna got sick, Victor had spent 4 years as a senior equipment technician at Nordell Construction. It was a good job, real diagnostic work. Complex hydraulic systems, the kind of troubleshooting that required patience and intuition more than any manual. He had liked it. He had been good at it in the quiet way people are good at things when they genuinely love the work rather than the title. He left when Joanna's treatments started, requiring someone home. The insurance helped, but not enough. The schedule didn't allow for what the schedule needed to allow for, so he left. He converted his father's old shop into a commercial repair business, took on whatever he could get, and built something modest but functional. Nordell became his biggest client by default. They sent the jobs their internal team refused. Equipment too old, too modified, too outside the parameters of whatever diagnostic software they'd invested in that quarter. Victor fixed things methodically. No drama, just work. He never heard from Nordell's leadership, not once, just the work orders, the deadlines, the invoices paid net 30. The woman who ran Nordell Construction was named Sandra Keough. She was 51, had taken over the company from a retiring partner 8 years ago, and had since expanded it from a regional player to one of the larger privately held construction firms in southern Alberta. Sharp. Strategically aggressive in the way the industry rewarded. Publicly credited with 3 major infrastructure contracts that had put Nordell on the map outside the province. She had approximately 6,000 employees. She knew about 200 of them by name. Victor Hale was not among them. To Sandra, the arrangement with Hale Mechanical was a line item. an external vendor with an above-average completion rate and below-average billing disputes. She had approved renewing the vendor contract twice without looking up what the company actually was or who ran it. Her operations director handled those details. That was why she had an operations director. But Nordale had grown faster than its internal systems could manage. Faster growth produces invisible rot. Everyone in construction knows this, and very few construction companies act on it before it's too late. Cost-cutting in procurement introduced inconsistency into maintenance cycles. Experienced internal technicians retired and were replaced with cheaper, younger staff who were undertrained and overextended. Equipment service intervals were pushed. Warranty claims increased. 3 pieces of heavy equipment failed on active job sites within a 6-month window. The third one was a crane. Nobody was injured. But it was close enough that the safety board opened a formal review. And when a safety board opens a formal review on a crane failure in Alberta, the financial consequences follow swiftly and do not negotiate. Contracts froze. 2 municipal clients put future bids on hold pending review outcomes. A key subcontractor pulled out of a joint venture. Sandra spent November and December in meetings she had never anticipated having, answering questions she did not have good answers to. It was during an internal audit in January that her operations director, a meticulous man named, actually, his name doesn't matter. What matters is what he found. He was tracking the pattern of equipment failures across the past 4 years, trying to identify the breakdown point, and he noticed something that should have been obvious, but had somehow never been looked at directly. The equipment Nordale had repaired in-house over the past several years had a failure rate 3 times higher than the equipment routed to external vendors. And within the external vendor category, there was one shop with a near-perfect record. A 2-bay operation in Lethbridge, Hale Mechanical. Every machine they had touched, and they had touched 43 machines over 7 years, had held, no returns, no sexy failure, no warranty dispute. The operations director brought the data to Sandra. She looked at it for a long time. 43 machines. 7 years, 0 secondary failures. She asked for the vendor file, a folder, 4 pages, company address, contact number, vendor, since 2017 owner, Victor Hale, 1 photo in the file from an old certificate of compliance inspection. A man in his mid-30s, standing beside a hydraulic lift, looking at the camera like he had somewhere else to be. Sandra stared at that photo for reasons she would not have been able to articulate clearly. 7 years, 43 machines. She had never once picked up the phone. The Friday in February when she came in person, Victor was in the middle of rebuilding a final drive motor on a late-model excavator that a local landscaping company had run harder than it was rated for. It was the kind of repair that required complete concentration and a very specific sequence of steps, and Victor was at the part of the sequence that did not tolerate interruption. Ren was at school. The shop was quiet except for the radio, CBC Radio 1, as always, and the particular sounds of the work itself. He heard the car pull in. The sound of it was wrong for a delivery, too quiet, too deliberately parked. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the step he was on, set the component down, wiped his hands, and then looked up. A woman in her early 50s, in a coat that cost more than most of his monthly net, was standing at the entrance to his shop. No assistant, no entourage, just her, standing in the February cold with her hands in her pockets, looking around the space with the expression of someone recalibrating something. He recognized her from industry photos, Sandra Keough. He had seen her face in articles about the Crow's Nest Pass Highway project. He had not expected to ever see her face in his shop. There was a silence between them that lasted a few seconds and contained about 7 years of history. Victor Hale, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yeah, he said. She introduced herself anyway, which he respected. She didn't assume. She said she had driven from Calgary that morning. She said she wanted to talk if he had time. He gestured at the stool near the office window. She sat down. He leaned against the workbench and waited. She was honest with him, which he hadn't expected either. She didn't come in with a prepared speech or executive framing. She told him about the crane failure, the safety review, the contract freezes, the data her operations director had found. She told him that the pattern of Nordale's internal failures, mapped against the pattern of Hale Mechanical's CISs, had pointed at something she couldn't dismiss. She said, "I think we've been doing something wrong internally for a long time, and I think you've been quietly compensating for it for 7 years without anyone thanking you for that." Victor looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the excavator he'd been working on. "The final drive on that machine," he said, "was run without proper lubrication intervals for about 2 seasons. By the time I got it, there was scoring on the ring gear you could feel, without a measuring tool. Whoever was maintaining it either didn't know what to look for, or didn't have time to look." He paused. "That's the kind of thing that gets missed when you're running a crew too thin." Sandra was quiet. "Is that what you think happened at Nordale?" "I think it's what happens everywhere when growth outruns process," he said. "I've seen it before. I used to work for you, actually. A long time ago." She hadn't known that. He could see it on her face when he said it, a small specific kind of discomfort that comes from realizing a gap you didn't know existed. He told her briefly. 2013 to 2017. Senior equipment technician under an operations manager named Finch, who had retired, and apparently taken most of the institutional knowledge with him. He didn't say it with bitterness. Just information. She asked him to look at Nordale's maintenance records from the past 3 years. He said he'd think about it. She nodded. And stood, and thanked him for his time. At the door of the shop she stopped and turned back. "The work orders we've been sending," she said, "you've never pushed back on a single one, even the ones that must have been a nightmare." Victor picked up his torque wrench. "The ones that are a nightmare pay the rent," he said, "and someone has to fix them." She left. He went back to the final drive. CBC Radio 1 moved from the news into a program about something happening in Ottawa. The shop smelled of cold metal and gear oil. Outside, the February light was the color of old bone. He thought about Wren, who had a science fair project due in 3 weeks, and who had already changed her topic twice, and who would almost certainly change it a 3rd time. He thought about the excavator. He thought about the fact that Sandra Keogh had driven 4 hours to sit on a stool in his shop and say the words out loud. He called her back that evening and said he'd look at the records. What Victor found in Nordale's maintenance documentation was not surprising to him, though it was alarming in its scope. The records showed a maintenance culture that had drifted gradually, incrementally, over 5 or 6 years, from proactive to reactive. Service intervals extended, inspections abbreviated, staff turnover in the maintenance department that had never been properly absorbed. A computerized fleet management system, purchased in 2020 that, based on the records, appeared to have been implemented without adequate training and then partially abandoned. It was not sabotage. It was not negligence in the deliberate sense. It was the slow erosion that happens when an organization scales faster than its knowledge base, and when the people who notice the erosion don't have the standing to make anyone listen. Victor submitted a written assessment. 41 pages, no recommendations without evidence, no conclusions without data. He proposed a remediation framework, not a quick fix, but a structured approach to rebuilding the maintenance culture from the equipment up, starting with the fleet categories that presented the highest safety risk. He had expected to pack. What he got instead was a phone call from Sandra asking how he wanted to structure his involvement. He was careful about this part. He had Wren. He had a shop to run. He had a life, modest as it was, that worked because its components were arranged in a specific way, and he was not willing to disarrange them for a title or a salary that came attached to conditions he couldn't meet. He said, no relocation. He said school pickups at 3:40, non-negotiable. He said, he would need to keep the shop running because it was his, and he had built it, and he was not interested in giving it up. He said, if Nordale wanted his expertise, they would need to fit around his life, not the other way around. Sandra agreed to all of it. He became Nordale's senior equipment reliability consultant. He worked 2 days a week in Calgary, drove Wren to schools first, got her picked up by his mother on those days. She had by this point been driving from Medicine Hat every Tuesday for 7 years and simply extended the arrangement without comment. On the other days, he worked from Lethbridge. On Fridays he was always at the shop. The fleet van still came on Fridays, but now there was a phone call first. The change at Nordale was not dramatic or fast. Meaningful change in large organizations rarely is, but it was real. Over the following year Victor worked with the maintenance team, not above them, with them, to rebuild the processes that had deteriorated. He asked questions more than he gave answers. He listened to the junior technicians, who turned out to know exactly where the problems were, and had been saying so in internal reports that had not been read. That part stayed with him. The reports had existed, someone had written them, and nobody had read them. He made sure they got read now. Sandra observed all of this. She had a habit, during this period, of being present in contexts where executives are usually absent. On the shop floor, in the maintenance bay, during shift handovers. Victor noticed it. It was different from how she had operated before. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. One afternoon she asked him why he'd agreed to come back. Not the practical reasons, the real one. He thought about it for a while before he answered. When you're raising a kid alone, he said, and you're trying to do it right, you think about what kind of world she's going to work in. What kind of organizations she's going to work for. Whether the people who do the actual work are going to be seen or not. He paused. I couldn't fix the whole thing by staying in my shop, I could fix it a little by being in the room. Sandra didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I didn't know you'd worked for us before, I should have. You have 6,000 employees, he said. That's not an excuse, she said, it's a description of a failure. He respected that. He didn't say so, but he did. Ren turned 8 that spring. She had settled on volcanoes for her science fair project, finally and definitively, and had won second place at the school level, which she declared was fine, because the first place project was about water filtration. And that was genuinely more important than volcanoes, if you thought about it. Victor put the second place ribbon on the fridge. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it for longer than made complete sense. He thought about Joanna, the way he still did, the way he probably always would. Not with the raw grief of the early years, that had changed into something quieter, more integrated, more like a presence than an absence. He thought she would have liked this version of things, not the loss, not the hard years, but this. The fridge with the ribbon on it, the morning routines, the shop still running, the work that mattered, the Friday vans still came, the work orders still had deadlines, the machinery that nobody else wanted to touch still ended up in Victor's bay, and Victor still fixed it. Now with a slightly different title, a slightly larger deposit in the account, and the same 2 hands he'd always had. Some things don't change because they don't need to. Some things change because someone finally bothered to look at what had been there all along. Ren asked him one evening, while he was helping her with her math homework at the kitchen table, whether he liked his job. He thought about the honest answer. Yeah, he said, I do. Even the broken parts, she asked. He looked at the question for a second. Especially the broken parts, he said. The broken ones are the ones that actually need someone. She considered this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old processing, something she suspected is important and isn't quite sure why. Then she went back to her fractions. And outside, past the yard and the back fence and the industrial road that led to the edge of town, the lights in the shop were still on.